Jake pulled into the parking lot of the 10-year reunion in a brand new Cadillac Escalade, stepped out in a blazer that fit a little too perfectly, and had a Rolex catching the parking lot lights before he even made it to the door. Derek showed up 20 minutes later in a 2015 Honda Civic with a dent in the bumper he'd never bothered fixing, wearing the same navy sport coat he'd worn to his cousin's wedding 3 years earlier. By the time dessert was served, everyone at that reunion had quietly ranked the two of them. Jake was the guy who'd made it. Derek was the guy who was still figuring things out. Every single person at that table was wrong, and it wasn't close. Jake had $1,800 in his checking account and a car payment that would follow him for the next 4 years. Derek had $190,000 sitting in index funds, a paid-off condo, and zero debt of any kind. This isn't a story about fancy cars being evil or old Hondas being secretly noble. It's about something almost nobody gets taught, a fork in the road that shows up in your 20s disguised as 100 small, reasonable decisions, until one day you look up and realize you and your old friend took completely different paths using the exact same paycheck. You can spend your money convincing a room full of people you've made it, or you can spend that same money actually making it. Almost nobody tells you these two things are opposites, and that the price of one is very often the exact thing that would have guaranteed the other. I want to break down why this trade-off is so much bigger than people realize, and exactly how to tell which side of that fork you're standing on right now, because most people assume they'd obviously pick wealth if the choice were ever laid out clearly. It almost never is. It shows up as a lease renewal, a slightly nicer apartment, a watch you tell yourself you deserve, and by the time the pattern is visible, years of compounding have already been spent on things that stopped mattering the second someone else stopped looking. Let's do the actual math, because the number is bigger than people expect. Jake's Escalade runs him about $650 a month once you count the lease, insurance, and gas for something that size. A vehicle like that loses close to 20% of its value the moment it drives off the lot and keeps bleeding value every year after. He's paying nearly $8,000 a year for something that's worth less every single day he has it. Over 5 years, that's close to $39,000 moving through his hands, most of it gone for good. Now, take that same $650 a month and put it into an S&P 500 index fund instead, averaging a conservative 8% a year. 5 years in, that's not $39,000 spent and gone. That's close to $50,000 sitting in an account, growing, and it hasn't even hit its steepest years of compounding yet. Jake and Derek make almost the same salary. The entire gap comes down to where the same dollars were told to go, toward a signal that fades the moment someone stops watching, or toward a number that keeps growing, whether anyone's watching or not. Here's why this trap is so easy to fall into, and it has nothing to do with being bad with money. Status signaling is a deeply wired human instinct, older than money itself, that used to serve an actual survival purpose. Visible resources meant visible protection, alliances, safety. That instinct never went anywhere. It's just aimed at a different target now, a leased SUV and a designer watch instead of livestock and land. And the safety it buys is a few seconds of admiration from people you'll mostly never think about again. This is the hedonic treadmill, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every status purchase gives you a genuine spike of satisfaction. That's not shallow. That's your brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is the spike gets shorter every time. The first nice watch feels incredible. The second one, bought a year later because the first stopped feeling special, gives a smaller high for less time. The treadmill only ever speeds up. It never slows down, no matter how much money you throw at it. Meanwhile, the satisfaction that comes from watching an investment account grow works in the opposite direction. It's quiet. Nobody claps when your portfolio crosses a milestone at 11 at night while you're checking an app alone in bed. But it doesn't fade either. Derek's $190,000 doesn't lose its meaning 6 months after he crosses that number, the way a new car loses its shine the first time someone dings the door in a Target parking lot. This is the actual mechanical reason wealth building takes more discipline than status spending, even even when they both cost the same money. One gives you an instant reward that decays, the other gives you a delayed reward that compounds. Here's a fact that should change how you look at every visibly wealthy person you meet from now on. Long-running studies of actual American millionaires have consistently found the same surprising pattern. Most of them live in ordinary middle-class neighborhoods, drive unremarkable cars, and would be completely invisible if you passed them at the grocery store. The stereotype of the guy in the brand-new Escalade usually describes someone with a high income and almost nothing saved, not someone who's actually built wealth. The people who've genuinely accumulated serious net worth have, more often than not, made themselves boring on purpose, not because they can't afford to look rich, but because they figured out that looking rich and staying rich pull in opposite directions.
I need to be honest about something here, because pretending this choice is free would be dishonest. There's a real social cost to being the guy in the Civic with the dented bumper. People do make assumptions, and some of them sting, especially in your 20s and 30s when comparison feels sharpest. Choosing invisible wealth means some people will underestimate you, and you won't get the instant credibility a flashy signal buys you in a room full of strangers. That's a real trade, not a free lunch dressed up as one. But here's what almost nobody weighs against that cost, because it's invisible until you've actually lived both sides. Being underestimated because your car is a Civic never traps you the way a $600 lease payment does. You can quit the job that's making you miserable because there's no payment locking you into a paycheck you can't afford to lose. You can walk away from the toxic client, the bad manager, the relationship that's draining you because your lifestyle was never built on income you might not have next year. The visible version of wealth locks you into maintaining the visibility. The invisible version sets you free precisely because nobody's watching closely enough to notice if it dips a little while you take a risk that actually matters. This shows up everywhere once you start looking. Housing does the most damage because it happens slowly and every step feels justified on its own. The apartment a little bigger than you need, the neighborhood that sounds better when you mention it, the renovation that impresses guests who visit twice a year. Stacked over a decade, that's the single biggest leak in most people's wealth-building potential, because every extra dollar spent there is a dollar that never gets the chance to grow anywhere else. Even generosity gets pulled in. Picking up the check in front of a group activates the same status wiring as a flashy car, while quiet generosity nobody ever finds out about doesn't give you that same social credit, so people drift toward the visible kind without ever noticing they're doing it. So here's the actual reframe. Every time you're about to spend real money on something, there's a better question hiding under the obvious one. The obvious question is, can I afford this? The useful one is, who is this actually for? If it's genuinely for you, something you'd still want even if nobody else ever saw it, that's a completely different category than something bought mainly for how it'll be perceived by people you'll mostly never think about again once the moment passes. This isn't an argument for never buying anything visible. It's about knowing the difference, because almost nobody, once they see the real math, would knowingly trade $50,000 of future freedom for an SUV that impresses strangers at a reunion they'll forget attending within a year. There's a practical version of this test you can actually run. Before any purchase above a threshold you set for yourself, for a lot of people that's somewhere around $500 to $1,000, sit with it for 24 hours and ask one thing. Would you still want it if nobody but you would ever know you had it? If the enthusiasm fades once you imagine it invisible, that's the tell. You weren't buying the object, you were buying the reaction, and that reaction, however good it feels for a moment, was never going to compound into anything that outlasts the moment itself. This decision compounds exactly like money does. The version of you who chooses wealth over appearance at 25 isn't just a little ahead by 30. The gap widens every year because one path quietly builds a foundation that grows on its own, while the other sits on a treadmill that has to be fed constantly just to maintain the same level of visible success. 10 years in, the difference between these two paths isn't a gap anymore. It's a completely different life, built from the exact same starting paycheck. Derek didn't set out to make anyone at that reunion feel a certain way about his Civic. He'd simply decided years earlier, after watching his older brother lose a good job and lose the leased truck and the expensive apartment inside of the same 3 months, that he'd rather be the kind of rich nobody could see and nobody could take away. Jake wasn't reckless or stupid with money either. He was doing exactly what everyone around him was doing, optimizing for a kind of success that felt real because it was visible, without ever once running the numbers against the alternative. 2 years after that reunion, the company Jake worked for went through layoffs. He kept his job, but his hours got cut, and for 4 straight months, that Escalade payment ate almost half of what he was bringing home. Derek, that same year, quietly took 3 months off to help his father recover from surgery, something he could only afford to do because his wealth had never depended on maintaining a visible lifestyle in the first place. Nobody at that reunion 2 years earlier would have predicted either outcome. You don't need to drive a beat-up Civic to build real wealth, and this isn't a moral position, it's a mathematical one. But somewhere in the next few years, you're going to make dozens of small decisions that quietly ask you the same question that fork asked Jake and Derek without either of them realizing it was even being asked. Do you want this money to make you look successful today, or do you want it to make you actually free later? Both are legitimate things to want. They just aren't the same thing, and spending money meant for one on the other is the single most common, most invisible way people spend decades working hard while staying nowhere close to where that work should have taken them. The people at that reunion who assumed Jake was the wealthier man weren't stupid. They were reading the only information they'd been given, information designed on purpose by decades of marketing and a very old survival instinct to be misread exactly that way. The real skill isn't refusing to spend money. It's learning to notice in the moment which purchases are actually for you and which ones only exist because somewhere, quietly, you were hoping someone would notice. Choose the one that's still worth something after everyone stops watching.